The suffocating September of 1851 descended upon Mississippi's Natchez district, with a heat that seemed to condense suffering itself into physical form. Humidity rising from the Mississippi River to create an atmosphere so oppressive that breathing felt like labor. Conditions that characterized a region where cotton cultivation had created fortunes so vast they exceeded even South Carolina's legendary rice wealth, but where those fortunes were built upon systematic brutality that killed workers with such efficiency that the region's enslaved population could only be sustained through constant importation. From Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas, where soil exhaustion was forcing liquidations that fed the Deep South's insatiable appetite for human labor. In the slave quarters of Oakmont Plantation, situated on particularly fertile bottomland where soil productivity made cotton cultivation extraordinarily profitable for the family who owned both the land and the people who worked it, field workers gathered in the evening darkness and spoke in voices carrying both horror and something approaching disbelieving hope about an extraordinary purchase that had occurred 6 weeks earlier at the Natchez slave market. A transaction that violated every pattern they had observed across years of witnessing how Mississippi planters made decisions about acquiring human property. According to accounts preserved with remarkable consistency in oral histories maintained by descendants, who recognized the story's profound significance, in late July of 1851, there had appeared at the Natchez market a man named Kofi, whose physical stature was so extraordinary that estimates of his height converged on 7 feet and 7 inches, brought to sale by a planter named Silas Rutherford from a plantation in Warren County under circumstances that the auctioneer's carefully vague descriptions suggested involved Rutherford's specific intentions for deploying someone of such exceptional size in ways that went far beyond normal agricultural labor to involve the systematic exploitation that characterized one of slavery's most horrific practices, the deliberate breeding of enslaved people treated not as human beings, but as livestock whose reproductive capacities could be manipulated and controlled to generate new property that would increase slaveholders' wealth through natural increase that required no capital outlay beyond the initial purchase of individuals selected specifically for physical characteristics that owners believed would produce valuable offspring. Multiple witnesses to the sale described how the auctioneer had emphasized Kofi's size and physical strength in language that made disturbingly explicit what purposes Rutherford had been using him for, and what purposes potential buyers might similarly employ him for if they wished to acquire someone whose exceptional physical characteristics might be transmitted to children, who would themselves become valuable property. The auctioneer spoke about prime breeding stock and about proven capability to produce strong offspring in terms that reduced a human being to the status of agricultural equipment or livestock being evaluated purely for reproductive capacity rather than for any recognition of humanity or dignity or rights that even slavery's minimal legal protections theoretically acknowledged. The descriptions made clear that Kofi had spent years at Rutherford's plantation, being forced into sexual relationships with enslaved women, specifically selected by Rutherford for characteristics he believed would produce children, whose size and strength would command premium prices when they reached ages where they could be sold or put to work. A practice that violated every principle of human dignity, but that Mississippi law not only permitted, but actively facilitated through legal frameworks that treated children born to enslaved mothers as property belonging to the mother's owners, regardless of paternity and regardless of whatever violence or coercion might have been involved in their conception. The reasons Rutherford was selling someone he had apparently invested years in using for such purposes remained unclear from the auctioneer's descriptions, though fragmentary comments suggested either that Kofi had begun resisting in ways that made continuing the arrangement dangerous or impractical, or that Rutherford had decided for economic reasons to liquidate this particular asset and deploy capital in other ways, or that circumstances at Rutherford's plantation had changed in ways making Kofi's presence there no longer viable for purposes that required ongoing management of complex and deeply coercive relationships that his resistance might be making increasingly difficult to maintain. Whatever the specific reasons, the fact of the sale created an opportunity that someone watching from the crowd surrounding the auction block had apparently been waiting for with careful attention and with purposes that no one observing the transaction would have anticipated or understood without knowing details about the buyer's background and convictions that surface appearances gave no indication of. Margaret Ashford, wife of plantation owner Thomas Ashford, whose own estate Riverside lay 30 miles north of Natchez in less productive hill country, where the family maintained modest operations that supported comfortable existence, without generating the extraordinary wealth that bottomland cotton plantations produced, had traveled to Natchez that July day with her husband, who had business with cotton factors and with various merchants whose operations sustained the region's commercial infrastructure. Margaret had accompanied Thomas ostensibly because she wished to visit with acquaintances and to attend to shopping that could only be accomplished in Natchez, where goods unavailable in smaller communities could be purchased. But she had also come with purposes she had not revealed to her husband, purposes that had been developing over months of careful planning as she worked to identify opportunities to act on moral convictions that she had concealed from Thomas and from the broader community, whose social and economic commitments to slavery made open opposition dangerous and potentially catastrophic for anyone who challenged the institution's legitimacy or who took concrete actions to undermine its operations. Margaret had grown up in a Philadelphia Quaker family, whose opposition to slavery was absolute, and whose members had been active in assisting fugitives despite legal risks that such activities involved. Religious and moral convictions that she had carried with her when she married Thomas and relocated to Mississippi, but that she had been forced to conceal completely, given that Mississippi society tolerated no criticism of slavery whatsoever, and that the state's legal structures made even private expression of anti-slavery sentiment potentially subject to prosecution under laws designed to prevent any challenge to an institution that Mississippi's economy and social order depended upon entirely. When she married Thomas in 1844, Margaret had hoped that she might gradually influence him toward recognizing slavery's evil, but she had quickly recognized that his commitment to the institution was too deep to be dislodged through gentle persuasion, and that her only options were either to accept complicity in a system she considered fundamentally immoral, or to find ways to take covert action that would allow her to live according to conscience, while maintaining the surface appearances of dutiful plantation mistress that her position required. Over the 7 years of their marriage, Margaret had been systematically learning about slavery's operations in Mississippi, observing how the domestic slave trade functioned, understanding what opportunities might exist for someone with resources to intervene in ways that could help people escape the system's worst abuses, and most significantly, accumulating capital through careful management of inheritance from her Philadelphia family that Mississippi law gave her some control over, despite the general legal principle that married women's property came under their husband's authority. She had developed contacts with the few Quakers living in Mississippi and Louisiana, whose anti-slavery convictions led them to take extraordinary risks to assist those seeking freedom, had learned about networks that moved fugitives toward free states despite enormous dangers and despite comprehensive legal apparatus designed to make such assistance criminal, and had been watching slave markets carefully for situations where intervention might be possible. Situations where someone was being sold under circumstances suggesting particular cruelty or exploitation that even slavery's normal brutality didn't encompass, and where purchase by someone with different intentions might provide genuine relief from horrors that the system permitted and encouraged. When Margaret observed Kofi being sold at the Natchez market that July morning, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions making explicit the purposes that Rutherford had been using him for, and the purposes that potential buyers might similarly employ him for, when she recognized that someone was being reduced to nothing more than a breeding mechanism whose humanity was completely erased in favor of treating him as livestock, whose only value came from reproductive capacity that could be exploited to generate new property, she made a decision that months of preparation had positioned her to act upon: that she would purchase this man specifically to remove him from the horrific exploitation he was experiencing, and to provide him with circumstances at Riverside where he would be treated as a human being rather than as breeding stock, regardless of the enormous personal and financial risks such action involved, and regardless of how Thomas would react when he discovered what she had done, and the purposes that had motivated her unprecedented interference in matters that every social convention and legal principle insisted belonged exclusively to male authority. Margaret's purchase of Kofi for $2,100, an extraordinary sum that reflected both his size and the auctioneer's emphasis on his supposed breeding value, shocked Thomas when he learned what his wife had done, creating a confrontation that multiple people witnessed as Thomas demanded explanations for behavior he found incomprehensible. Margaret's response was carefully calculated to provide justifications that Thomas might accept, while concealing her actual moral convictions and her specific intentions for how Kofi would be treated at Riverside. She explained that she had observed Kofi's obvious physical capabilities and had calculated that his labor value for heavy work at Riverside would justify the purchase price despite its magnitude, that she believed acquiring someone of such size and strength would improve plantation operations in ways that would generate returns exceeding the capital invested, and that she had acted on her authority as mistress of Riverside to make an acquisition that she judged would benefit the household's economic interests, even if Thomas himself might not have made the same decision. The explanations were deliberately misleading about Margaret's actual motivations, but were constructed to appeal to economic reasoning that Thomas might accept. And after initial anger at what he perceived as inappropriate interference in his authority, Thomas apparently concluded that while he disagreed with his wife's judgment about the wisdom of such an expensive purchase, the transaction was completed and the capital spent, and that managing Kofi's labor effectively would be necessary to justify the investment, regardless of whether the initial decision had been sound. What Thomas did not understand, what Margaret's careful performance successfully concealed, was that her intentions for how Kofi would be treated at Riverside bore no relationship to maximizing economic returns, but rather involved creating circumstances that would allow someone who had experienced years of horrific exploitation to live with some measure of dignity and humanity even within the constraints that slavery imposed, and that Margaret could not openly challenge without endangering both herself and Kofi. Kofi arrived at Riverside in early August 1851, transported by wagon from Natchez, with Margaret providing explicit instructions to the enslaved workers who accompanied him that he was to be treated with respect and that any abuse would not be tolerated. From the moment of his arrival, Margaret worked to establish conditions that differed dramatically from what he had experienced at Rutherford's plantation, rather than being assigned to the systematic sexual exploitation that had characterized his years in Warren County. He was assigned to agricultural labor that utilized his strength, but that involved no reproductive exploitation whatsoever. Rather than being treated as breeding stock whose only value came from reproductive capacity, he was provided with housing comparable to what other workers received and with food and clothing that met basic needs. And rather than being subjected to the constant surveillance and coercive management that forced breeding required, he was largely left to work autonomously as long as he maintained reasonable productivity. Most significantly, Margaret made absolutely clear to overseers and to Thomas himself that Kofi was not to be used for any breeding purposes whatsoever, that he was not to be forced into any relationships, and that his personal life was to remain entirely his own business without any interference or management from those who claimed authority over other aspects of his existence. The insistence on these terms created confusion among overseers, who had assumed based on the auction descriptions that Kofi's purchase was motivated by breeding intentions similar to Rutherford's, and who expected to receive instructions about which women he should be paired with. Confusion that Margaret resolved by stating firmly that she had purchased him for agricultural labor only, and that she wanted no discussion of any other purposes. The initial weeks and months following Kofi's arrival at Riverside involved a gradual and cautious process through which he came to understand that Margaret's treatment of him reflected genuine intentions rather than some temporary situation that would eventually revert to the exploitation he had experienced previously. Multiple accounts preserved in oral traditions describe how Kofi initially maintained profound wariness and emotional distance, how he seemed to expect that the relatively humane treatment was temporary, or was designed to lower his guard before some new form of exploitation would be imposed, and how it took months of consistent treatment before he began to trust that circumstances at Riverside might genuinely differ from what he had experienced during his years at Rutherford's plantation. Margaret's interactions with Kofi during this period were carefully managed to communicate respect for his humanity, while maintaining the surface appearances that Mississippi society required. She provided additional food beyond minimal subsistence, ensured that his housing was maintained in good condition, intervened when overseers attempted to impose punishments or to exercise the kind of arbitrary authority that characterized normal plantation management, and most importantly, made absolutely clear through both words and actions that she viewed him as a human being whose dignity mattered rather than as property, whose only value came from labor or reproductive capacity that could be extracted through coercion. The situation created complications that Thomas found increasingly difficult to understand or to accept. He recognized that Margaret was treating Kofi in ways that differed from how other enslaved workers were managed, that she seemed to have specific protections in place that prevented overseers from exercising normal authority, and that the entire arrangement seemed motivated by purposes beyond the economic calculations that should have governed decisions about managing expensive property. His questions about Margaret's unusual interest in how Kofi was treated were met with responses that deflected inquiry without providing the kind of detailed explanations that might have revealed her actual moral convictions, or her specific intentions to provide someone with refuge from horrors that the system permitted and encouraged. Over the 3 years between Kofi's arrival at Riverside in August 1851 and the summer of 1854, when circumstances changed in ways that created new possibilities, his life at the plantation represented an extraordinary departure from the exploitation he had experienced previously. He worked in agricultural labor that utilized his strength, but that was no different in fundamental nature from work that other field workers performed. He was not subjected to any form of reproductive exploitation. He was treated with basic respect that acknowledged his humanity even within the constraints that slavery imposed. And he gradually developed something approaching trust, that circumstances at Riverside reflected Margaret's genuine intentions, rather than temporary conditions, that would eventually change when purposes he didn't understand had been served. The accounts preserved in oral traditions describe how Kofi changed visibly over these years, how the profound wariness and emotional shutdown that had characterized his initial months at Riverside gradually diminished as consistent treatment demonstrated that Margaret's protections were genuine and enduring, how he began to engage in normal social relationships with other enslaved workers rather than maintaining the emotional isolation that years of forced breeding had imposed, and how he seemed to gradually rediscover some capacity for experiencing daily existence as something other than an ordeal to be endured until death provided release from circumstances that destroyed human dignity so completely that survival itself felt like a form of degradation that was almost worse than death would have been. Margaret's relationship with Kofi during these years remained carefully bounded by the social conventions that Mississippi society required, while nevertheless communicating respect and recognition of his humanity that transcended slavery's normal operations. She never attempted the kind of paternalistic intimacy that some slaveholders performed as demonstrations of supposedly benevolent concern. Never sought gratitude or expressions of appreciation for treatment that she considered simply meeting minimal standards of human decency that should never have required explicit recognition, but consistently ensured through her management of plantation operations that he was protected from the worst abuses that slavery permitted, and that his daily existence reflected acknowledgement that he possessed inherent dignity, regardless of legal status that classified him as property. The situation reached a turning point in the summer of 1854, when Thomas died unexpectedly from yellow fever that swept through the Natchez district. His death leaving Margaret as sole owner of Riverside with legal authority to make decisions about plantation operations, without requiring her husband's approval or acceptance. The change in circumstances created possibilities that Margaret had been contemplating for years, but that Thomas's presence had made impossible to pursue openly. Possibilities that involved not merely providing Kofi with relatively humane treatment within slavery's constraints, but actually facilitating his escape to freedom through networks she had maintained contact with throughout her years in Mississippi. In the months following Thomas's death, Margaret began implementing plans she had been developing in careful detail. She provided Kofi with information about escape routes toward free states, connected him with contacts who could provide assistance, supplied him with forged papers identifying him as a free man named Charles Williams, traveling on legitimate business, and most significantly, created conditions that would allow him to leave Riverside in ways that would appear to be unauthorized flight, rather than facilitated escape so that she could maintain plausible deniability about her role in his departure that would protect both her and the networks that were assisting him. The escape occurred in November of 1854, approximately 3 years and 3 months after Margaret had purchased Kofi at the Natchez slave market, with purposes no one observing the transaction would have understood or anticipated. He left Riverside carrying the forged papers Margaret had provided, money sufficient to sustain him through weeks of careful travel, and detailed information about contacts along routes toward free states who could provide assistance despite enormous risks. The journey from Mississippi to free territory required extraordinary courage and careful navigation through hundreds of miles where recapture was constant danger. But according to fragmentary accounts preserved by networks that assisted fugitives, Kofi successfully reached Canada by early 1855 and established himself in freedom that was secured by British law refusing to recognize American slavery or to cooperate with recapture efforts. Back at Riverside, Margaret managed the aftermath with carefully prepared performance that attributed Kofi's disappearance to ordinary escape attempt rather than to facilitated departure, organized searches that she knew would be ineffective, and maintained the fiction that she was a victim of theft rather than someone who had deliberately freed expensive property, because moral convictions required such action, regardless of financial costs or legal risks. The performance was never entirely convincing to those who had observed her unusual interest in Kofi's treatment over the years. But Mississippi law required proof rather than suspicion to prosecute assistance to fugitives, and Margaret's careful planning ensured that no documentary evidence existed that could support charges against her even if authorities suspected her complicity. The broader significance of what Margaret accomplished between July 1851 and November 1854 extends beyond the specific details of one man's rescue to illuminate both slavery's capacity for imposing particularly horrific forms of exploitation, and the possibilities that moral conviction combined with resources and careful planning could create for undermining such exploitation even within a system designed to make resistance impossible. The story demonstrates that some white Southerners recognized slavery's evil, despite social pressures demanding support for the institution. That women whose legal status as married subordinates denied them formal power could nevertheless find ways to exercise moral agency through resources they controlled and through careful subversion of expectations about dutiful behavior. And that the breeding practices that characterized one of slavery's most horrific dimensions could be challenged by people willing to risk everything to provide relief from exploitation that reduced human beings to breeding stock, whose only value came from reproductive capacity that slaveholders could control and exploit. And sometimes, according to stories preserved across generations by descendants who recognize their profound significance, resistance to slavery involved not just the enslaved people who fled or who fought, or who maintained dignity despite systematic efforts to destroy it, but also people whose social positions and legal status suggested they should have been defenders of the system, but who instead used whatever resources and opportunities their positions provided to undermine slavery's operations and to provide refuge from its worst abuses. The woman who purchased a man at Natchez Market in 1851 specifically to save him from years of forced breeding, who provided him with 3 years of treatment acknowledging his humanity, and who ultimately facilitated his escape to freedom in Canada, demonstrated through her actions that slavery's comprehensive evil could be recognized and resisted, even by those whose social circumstances seemed to make them beneficiaries of the system. That moral conviction could lead people to sacrifice financial interests and to risk social ruin and legal prosecution for principles they considered more fundamental than economic advantage or social acceptance. And that the man who stood 7 feet 7 inches tall and who had been reduced to breeding stock at one Mississippi plantation could be recognized and treated as a human being deserving of dignity, and ultimately could achieve freedom through the courage of someone who understood that certain moral imperatives transcended every other consideration, regardless of whatever costs acting according to conscience might require her to pay.